Oshiro's life was devoid of adventures. Born into an ordinary family, he spent his days free from troubles and chaos, leading a life that was simply mundane and monotonous, where nothing remarkable ever occurred. He believed his existence was destined for mediocrity, but everything changed when he encountered the hero's fate. With a look of astonishment, Oiro's eyes widened as he gazed at the monitor in front of him, where a game character came to life. He realized that his life took a turn the moment he became a master of the game. As the sun dipped behind the towering residential buildings, Oshiro loosened his tie and reached for the table, yearning for solitude. He began to reflect on his deep-seated disdain for school. Pressing the power button on his computer, he felt no shame in his passion for single-player games. Sitting before the glowing screen, a smile crept across his face as he massaged his hands, feeling like a king. He mused about the beauty of single-player games, where one could always save and restart, beginning anew. With cheats, he could shatter all limitations and emerge as the strongest. Oiro realized that in this realm, the world was crafted solely for one player. With a curious expression, he donned his gaming headphones and reacted with surprise to the events unfolding on the screen. A grin spread across his face as he contemplated trying again. The screen indicated that the game character was being revived, and in the chat visible on the monitor, one user noted that the broadcast was happening on a weekday, implying that Oshiro was likely a middle or high school student. Another user chimed in, questioning whether this student began streaming right after school, to which a third user responded, suggesting that while it might be true, they doubted one could make a living from streaming. After that, another user pointed out that this is a turn-based strategy game, so it can be pretty dull to watch live. However, this user mentioned that Oshiro is doing well. Following that, he asked Oshiro if he plans to pursue this professionally in the future. The second user agreed with this observation, noting that Oshiro is quite clever. Oshiro, smiling at the monitor, realized these guys really struggle to give compliments. Suddenly, a notification popped up on the screen indicating that one of the users who had just messaged him sent $10. Oshiro was taken aback by this generosity and thought about sending a thank you note to the user. Out of nowhere, another notification appeared, revealing that one of the users had sent him $1,000. Oshiro froze in shock, staring at the monitor in disbelief. He began to grip the monitor tightly, cursing and repeatedly asking how much he had just received, his eyes and mouth wide open in astonishment. One of the users noticed that he had sent $1,000 and remarked that Oshiro hadn't even acknowledged it. This user then pointed out that there are certain basic streamers follow to showcase their best selves. Another user chimed in, joking that soon Oshiro would start crying and begging for the money back. After that, the user who had recently sent $11,000 to Oshiro requested him to read the letter he had sent. Oshiro looked at the monitor in surprise and asked again about the letter. He noticed a number 1 next to the letter icon on his desktop, indicating a new notification. Oshiro clicked on the letter with his mouse, and a message opened up, stating that the game master wanted him to know that he is a viewer who enjoys watching his channel and is also an indie game developer. Oshiro found himself surprised as a game developer. The game master kept telling him about a particular game he had spent a lot of time creating, mentioning that it might be too tough since no one had passed the beta test. Oshiro chuckled with interest while reading these messages. The game master went on to say he would appreciate it if Oshiro could leave a review after finishing the game, so they could tweak the difficulty. He also noted that he requested not to publish or distribute anything related to it. Oshiro glanced at the monitor and said, "This." He reread the message where it mentioned that perhaps the game was too hard, but no one had managed to pass the beta test. Oshiro thought about how this was a game that no one had been able to complete during the beta phase. He opened his mouth, staring at the monitor, where a question was posed to him: did he want to give it a try? With a confident smile, he thought that even an ordinary person like him could become something special. He then shouted, "Yes," and clicked the cursor on his computer mouse to confirm, eager to install the game. He pressed the button on the mouse, shouting loudly that he would do it, and swore harshly, repeating, "Of course, yes." Soon after, a notification popped up on the monitor saying the installation of Hero's Fate was complete. Oshiro was prompted to start the game, and the system window informed him that in the game, it was the year 294 according to the imperial calendar. The kingdom of Je had invaded the neighboring kingdom of Rock, turning it into a solid sea without fire, marking the start of a turbulent era. Oshiro was told he was born with a small and insignificant soul, and his mission was to survive these turbulent times, become a hero, and bring down his hammer of justice on the evil god to ascend to the throne. The system window informed Oshiro that by doing this, he could fulfill any wish. Oshiro thought this was the reason the game was titled The Fate of the Hero. He then realized that the graphics in this game were rather unremarkable. Afterward, he recalled the creator mentioning that he had developed this game himself, which made him think that under these circumstances, it wasn't too bad. The system window prompted Oshiro to enter his character's name. Oshiro pondered this request, concluding that it wasn't particularly significant. He then typed "The Game Master" on the keyboard. The system window welcomed the Game Master to the continent of Erin. Oshiro found himself amidst a stunning landscape filled with mountains, the sea, and forests, surrounded by trees. He was taken aback by his surroundings. Looking at the screen, he asked, "What is this?" wondering if there was any training available. However, he soon realized everything was quite clear, so he doubted he would need any training. As he gazed ahead, he noticed a man standing before him, the village chief. The chief, with a weary expression, recognized that he was seeing Oshiro for the first time and inquired about his purpose in the village. Oshiro pressed his lips together, questioning what was happening. He then asked if there were any options for responses, noticing he could write his answer in the blank line after his name. Oshiro cursed in confusion, asking again if he really had to write it himself. He reacted in surprise, unable to believe it. Then, he pressed the keyboard and began to address the village chief, demanding all the gold coins or threatening to kill all the villagers. The village chief listened, holding a wooden object behind his back. Oshiro stared at his computer screen, feeling exhausted. The village chief, with a swift motion of his hand gripping a wooden stick, struck Oshiro on the head and demanded to know who he thought he was. Following that, the village chief called him a minor. Oshiro let out a painful sound from the forceful blow to his head. Bewildered, he wondered what the monitor screen was displaying as his eyelids grew heavy. Eventually, Oshiro collapsed lifelessly to the ground. The system window informed Oshiro that he had died, and the cause was a blunt force injury. He lay in a pool of blood in the middle of the road. Oshiro screamed loudly as the system window appeared on the screen, asking if he wanted to try again. With beads of sweat trickling down his face, he exclaimed in surprise, "Wow." After that, he questioned whether he had died from a simple conversation with an NPC. He glanced at the options presented by the system window, cursed at it with an irritated look, and then shouted, "Yes." Oshiro thought this was starting to get on his nerves, so he cursed the game again. When he encountered the village chief once more, the chief remarked that it was the first time he had seen him. He then asked Oshiro why he had come to this village. Crossing his fingers over his chest and wearing a pleading expression, Oshiro told the village chief that he was lost and hadn't eaten or drunk anything for a long time. He begged the chief to show a little compassion for a poor man. The village chief turned around, leaning on his wooden stick, chuckled, and told Oshiro to just follow him. With a surprised look and sweat running down his face, Oshiro followed the village chief. After a while, they entered a room where Oshiro remained silent, watching the village elder. The elder handed him a glass and asked him to drink it and leave peacefully. Oshiro took the glass, thanking the elder for it. Then he rested his hand on his side and started to sip from the glass. Soon after, his expression shifted, he looked pained as he began to collapse. A notification popped up, indicating he had been poisoned by a toxic drink. Following that, the system window informed him that he had died from the poison, and the reason for his demise was a lethal toxin. Oshiro sat in a chair, showing no signs of life. Irritated, he sarcastically exclaimed that this was just fantastic. He then remarked with a hint of malice in his voice that he had died once again. After that, Oshiro glanced at his computer's system unit, a sly smile creeping onto his face, and pondered to himself, "What if I unplug one of the wires connected to my system unit?" He then triumphantly shouted that without an internet connection, the NPC wouldn't be able to do anything. He realized he was definitely going to suffer now. A while later, Oshiro approached the village elder, who was experiencing a lot of interference on the screen. The elder, addressing Oshiro, mentioned that he was seeing him for the first time and asked why he had come to the village. Oshiro incomprehensibly replied that it was due to internet issues. Shortly after, a message appeared on the screen stating that he had died because Oshiro had said something ridiculous, resulting in his tongue being cut off, with severe bleeding being the cause of death. Then a question popped up on the screen asking if he wanted to try again. In a fit of rage, Oshiro threw the computer mouse onto his desk, staring ahead in confusion. He couldn't believe he couldn't manage even with the internet off. He started to reason that the person who sent him the letter must be the game's creator. He looked at the username and asked himself again, who is this? Eventually, he concluded that people online had no clue who he was. Oshiro, with a pensive look on his face, gazed ahead while resting his hand on his chin, pondering to himself, what is the name of the development team? He then shifted his focus to the electronic clock, which displayed that it was currently 1:38 in the morning. Cursing under his breath, Oshiro realized it was already past midnight. He decided he had done enough for the day and saved his game by selecting the appropriate option. Oshiro reflected on how he never imagined he would need to converse with an NPC. It felt akin to being told that the world of the hero's fate truly existed, a notion he vowed never to accept. Lying on the bed close to his computer chair and equipment, with his hand on his face, he mused that this was likely why no one completed the beta test. As he closed his eyes, preparing for sleep, they suddenly shot open wide with excitement. From that moment, he dedicated himself wholeheartedly to becoming exceptional, unaware of how much time he would invest in this endeavor. Constantly clicking his computer mouse to load and save, he immersed himself in the game repeatedly. Fast forward 10 years, and Oiro found himself at his desk in an office building when a charming girl named Suzara approached him, informing him that she had sent him an edited document. He smiled at her and expressed his gratitude when evening arrived. Suzara then asked him if he had completed his work. After noticing their hard work, Oshiro turned to her and thanked her for her efforts. Suzara bit her lip and gazed ahead, feeling uncertain. She looked up at him, her face flushed with embarrassment, and invited him to dinner at her home. She then inquired if he would accept her invitation. Oiro regarded her with a serious expression while holding a briefcase. Suzara appeared pitiful as she awaited his response with anxiety. Oshiro asked her again, then apologized, explaining that he couldn't stay. With a smile, Suzara pressed him once more, but Oshiro clarified that today was a significant day for him. He waved his hand apologetically, suggesting they could arrange it for another time. Suzara, looking confused while seated in her chair, agreed with him, but as he left, she remarked that he had turned her down again. After the workday ended, Oshiro returned to his home in a tall, modern residential building. Just like a decade ago, he loosened his tie, wearing a confident expression as he looked ahead, telling himself that today he would fulfill the destiny of a hero. He picked up the computer mouse in his hand. Later, when morning arrived, Oiro exhaled deeply. On his monitor, a congratulatory message appeared, stating that he was the first person to enter the Hall of Fame. Looking at this, Oshiro declared that this was the end. He focused intently on his screen, and with a joyful expression, Oiro shouted that he had finally beaten the game. As he celebrated, he clenched his fist and raised it triumphantly. However, soon after, the smile faded from his face, and he sat there with a somber expression, reflecting on the fact that 10 years had gone by. After that, his hands fell to his sides as he realized that while he was playing, he truly wanted to be special, but his life remained pretty average. Oshiro quietly gazed at the glowing monitor in front of him, and with a smile, he admitted he felt devastated. Oh, Shiro thought he might have a second chance at life. He started to recall the Black Prince Gale, Krakow, Cardinal Chesser, Ravelo, and the witch Celestine Yulin. He found them to be incredibly charming and unique, and their reactions were so lively that it was hard to tell them apart from real people. He remembered the joy he felt being surrounded by these characters and sometimes wondered if such people existed in his own world. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes with his palms, muttering that this was really the end. Suddenly, his computer chimed, and Oshiro looked at it in surprise, asking what was going on. A system window popped up on his screen, asking if he wanted to embark on a new adventure. Below the question was a note explaining that if he chose yes, he would be transported to the continent of Erin. It also mentioned that once he agreed, he wouldn't be able to return until he completed his journey. The system window urged him to think carefully about his decision. Osairo, confused, wondered what this was all about, frowning as he asked if it was a hidden scenario. He then inquired again about a continuation. Grabbing the computer mouse, he thought about the thrill and excitement he could feel again. Almost immediately, Oiro shouted with excitement in his eyes that he couldn't refuse. Once he made his choice, the space around him began to warp, and a notification explained that he was being transported to the continent of Erin. Soon after, a greeting appeared, calling him an apostle. Osairo exhaled heavily and, in confusion, asked what kind of nonsense this was, noticing with surprise that his chest was burning intensely. Then he let out a painful breath and, looking around in confusion, asked where he was. He realized that just a moment ago he had been in a room. Suddenly, someone turned to him and noticed that he had finally woken up. The person who spoke to him was an incredibly happy adult man named Russell. Russell mentioned that if they hadn't had such a valuable potion, he wouldn't have been able to meet the dawn. Oshiro and a new guy looked ahead in fear, while Oshiro, with a pained expression, stared in surprise. Lying on the bed, Russell addressed him as Mr. Calix. The protagonist asked who he was. Russell frowned, his eyebrows knitting together in seriousness, and chuckled. At that moment, he was thinking about how the doctor hadn't warned him about the possibility of memory loss. The protagonist, in shock, wondered who this person was and where he was. Russell asked if he really didn't remember him. Then, pressing his hand to his chest, he bowed and introduced himself as Russell. Calix asked him again, and Russell was internally questioning how he should interpret this. He realized they were definitely not in Japan, and he wasn't speaking Japanese. The protagonist, with beads of sweat trickling down his pale face, clutched the blanket tightly. He understood the words being spoken, but his chest hurt so much it felt like it was on fire. The protagonist began to writhe in pain, his body tensing up as he shook and clenched his jaw. Russell approached him, extending his hand and shouting, "Prince." Then, pressing his hands to his hips, he apologized and explained that it was all due to his haste. After that, Russell reassured Calix not to worry, clarifying that the pain was just a side effect of the potion. Meanwhile, the main character continued to shrink back while lying on the bed. He let out a heavy sigh from his lungs. Russell reassured him that everything would soon be okay. After that, Russell pressed his hand to his chest and suggested that recovery might take a bit longer. He asked Calix to forgive him and promised to visit soon. As he left the room, he once again sought forgiveness. The main character was left alone in the room, surrounded by various wooden furniture, illuminated only by the light of a single candle. Calix lay on the bed, his face showing a pained expression, exhaling heavily. Time passed without any change. Eventually, the candle burned down halfway, leaving only melted, smoking wax. When the main character finally woke up, he got to his feet, realizing it had been a good dream. He walked on his thin legs toward the mirror on the opposite wall. As he approached and looked at his reflection, he understood that he wasn't imagining things. Staring at the person in the mirror, he felt disconnected from his own body. In fear, he asked, "What is my name?" Gripping his hair and moving in a panic, he wondered why he could only remember 30 years of his life. He moved around frantically, shouting that he couldn't recall his usual name. Then, he focused on his reflection and asked, "Who am I?" He touched the mirror with his hand, and suddenly, a system window appeared in front of Calix. He stared at it in fear, his eyes wide open. The main character shouted in surprise, realizing it was a system window. Information about his character was displayed there. His name was Calix, he was a 15-year-old boy of noble status, and he belonged to Shirken County. He didn't have a job, just like he didn't have any special skills. His situation was all about recovering from an injury. The injury he was healing from was a stab wound to the chest. Calix's combat abilities were top-notch, ranking at the 8th level out of 37. His fame was rated 3 out of 7, and his reputation stood at 14%. He had skills in administration, finance, and military affairs, plus he was good at diplomacy and development. The protagonist was taken aback, stretching out his hand in front of him, wondering if this was the fate of a hero. With a scared look on his face, he couldn't believe he was actually being sent to the continent of Erin. In Calix's memories, a system window popped up, asking if he wanted to start a new adventure. Below that message was a note saying that if he chose yes, he would be transported to the continent of Erin and wouldn't be able to return until his journey was complete. The system window urged him to think it through carefully. Calix, straining his body and feeling irritated by his memories, questioned whether he just wanted to dive into the game. Looking around, the main character noted that this place was the main stage of a hero's fate, the continent of Erin. Calix tried to catch his breath as sweat dripped down his face. He raised his hand to his chest, realizing he needed to calm down. Then, he fixed his tense gaze on the mirror in front of him, pressed his hand to his chest, and painfully exhaled. Suddenly, he dropped to his knees, shaking in pain and making distressed sounds. He cursed, feeling the pain was unbearable, but he didn't wake up. It dawned on him that this wasn't a dream, it was reality. He was lying on the floor, staring ahead. He mentioned that he would have to get used to the unusual name of this man. Then he revealed that his name is Calix Shaken. He crawled over to his bed and rested his face and hands on it. He noticed the system window and looked at it with a surprised expression. He realized that if he just wanted to check his status, this window would pop up immediately. He gasped in surprise and exclaimed that only he could see this thing, a smile spreading across his face and his eyes sparkling with joy. He shouted that this was amazing, his cheeks flushing red. The main character, filled with excitement as he gazed at the system window, suggested they start gathering information. With a smirk and raised eyebrows, Calix thought about how being careless in this world could lead to his demise. He focused on the information in the system window, which stated he belonged to the county of Shirken. Looking at this, he realized that the name Calix was that of the son of the county of Shirken. It made sense that his last name matched the territory's name, indicating he was a direct descendant of the esteemed count's family. The protagonist, with a contemplative look at the system window, acknowledged his luck but knew he still needed to read more. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door leading to his room. Calix, filled with fear, glanced toward the sound and mentally questioned who it could be. He hurriedly wondered how he should act, then abruptly asked himself what he should do, his expression tense and frightened. He understood that he needed to calm down first, realizing it would be disastrous if anyone discovered he had taken over this body. With wide eyes, Calix stared ahead, coming to terms with the fact that he was a high-ranking aristocrat, once a direct descendant of the Calix Shaken Count's family. He found himself in a state of incredible tension, repeatedly asserting that he was indeed Calix Shaken. Then, he inquired about who was behind the door. A girl stood there, holding something in her hands. She referred to him as a prince and informed him that it was time for his medicine. In her hands, she carried a wooden tray, which held a deep plate. Calix, gazing at the door, pondered if she was a maid. It dawned on him that he needed to adjust to this new treatment. Sitting on the bed, he commanded her to enter. A girl named Lyra stepped into the room and sought his forgiveness. The protagonist looked at her in surprise as Lyra knelt before him, presenting the tray and urging him to take his medicine. She then gazed into his eyes, asking him once more to take it before it cooled down. Confused, Calix looked at her and replied that he would. It was then that he recognized his mistake and mentally berated himself for being foolish. He sharply questioned what he was doing, realizing that it was akin to denying his identity as Calix. With a surprised expression, Lyra asked if something was wrong. The protagonist quickly responded that nothing was amiss, understanding that it was more accurate to say there was nothing wrong with simply trying. A system window appeared before him, detailing Lyra's information. She was 23 years old, a commoner from the outskirts of Viscount Caution, working as a maid. Her disposition was that of a cold-blooded egoist, her status was normal, and her combat power was classified as third class, at level 33 out of a possible 51, with a glory rating of 1 out of 7. Her reputation was quite poor, rated at -3, and her skills included administration, finance, diplomacy, development at level F, and military affairs at level E. The protagonist, examining the system window, realized her name was LRA. He was surprised to see that her affiliation was with the outskirts of Viscount Caution. He wondered to himself, doesn't this imply that she serves Caution and not his family? As he looked at the system window near her face, he deduced that being classified as third class meant she couldn't use mana. However, by the standards of his world, her training was equivalent to that of special forces, which he recognized as the elite. This led him to question why she was merely a maid. At that moment, LRA was gazing intently into his eyes, remaining still on her knees with a tray extended before her. Calix, observing her, realized he came from a family of nobility, yet he was being served by a maid from another household. He understood that if a maid from a different family offered him medicine, it was something he should definitely avoid. He pressed his lips together, staring intently at the vessel LRA held in her hands. LRA, looking anxious, asked him, "Prince," and once again extended the tray, urging him to drink. KX exhaled deeply and requested her to place the medicine on the table. LRA moved even closer, beaming at him and insistently encouraging him to drink it quickly. The main character, with a tense expression and irritation evident on his face, veins bulging, took the deep plate in his hand and glared menacingly ahead, mentally cursing LRA. He thought he would never consume this concoction. As he brought the plate to his face, he suddenly began to cough and wince in pain, throwing the plate aside while shouting about how everything hurt. Lyra focused intently on the plate that was drifting away from him. KX glanced at her from beneath his brows, silently questioning how this was a move in her favor. Lyra kept her eyes on the plate as it flew away, and with a remarkably swift, sharp, and precise motion, she positioned her hand beneath it. The protagonist stared at her in genuine astonishment, lying on the floor. In an instant, Lyra managed to seize the plate without spilling its contents. Afterward, she looked ahead with a cold gaze from under her brows. Six regarded her with fear, wondering what kind of absurdity this was. Lyra grasped a deep plate containing an elixir and lifted it high. The protagonist was taken aback by her incredible speed. She stood up and examined the potion in her hands. Calix watched her with a tense expression, realizing that her skills had ruined his plans. Then, Lyra turned away from him and began to place the potion on the tray. At that moment, Calix emitted painful sounds, straining his entire body. Lyra noticed that it was fortunate she had managed to save the medicine. Calix, unwilling to dwell on the negative, lowered his face into his hands and began to exhale heavily. Lyra looked at him in confusion, her expression questioning. The main character understood that he could genuinely perish here. He recognized that this was undoubtedly poison and that he would never drink it. He started to collapse from his bed. Lion noticed this and turned his gaze toward him, worry etched on his face. As Six was falling, he thought about how he needed to distract her from the cup, but he didn't have time to fall, as Lyra, with the same swift motion, caught him before he hit the floor. After placing him back on the bed, she asked if he was all right. The main character responded negatively, bewildered and pondering what he should do about her. He realized that she had come to him rather quickly, so he took a careful look at the system window displaying Lyra's characteristics. Frowning at this, Calix inquired about the Viscounty caution that LRA served. He began to explain that he was the son of the Count's first wife, who had already passed away by that time. LRA seated him on the bed, holding him gently with her hands. Calix pondered whether he had a half-brother from his father's second wife, concluding that he indeed did, and that this brother was older than him at 16 years old. He then questioned if the maiden name of the Count's second wife was Caution. It dawned on him that LRA was serving the second wife, implying that his stepmother had intentionally sent this servant to him. Furthermore, Calix understood that she was highly trained to kill. He contemplated that if he were to die, his stepmother's son would ascend as the next count, which typically leads to a rivalry between two brothers for the throne. A happy expression spread across his face as he smiled, his eyes sparkling with excitement at the thought of such a thrilling fate for the hero. He felt pleased that it would be incredibly challenging. Afterward, Calix turned to LRA and assured her that he was feeling fine. He expressed his gratitude and, with a smile, asked her how his stepmother was doing. As he posed this question, he gazed intently at LRA, who appeared momentarily taken aback and looked at him in surprise. She quickly regained her composure and informed him that the Countess was very distressed by the prince's suicide attempt, adding that she had asked him to promise never to do that again. Calix stared ahead, deep in thought, questioning whether the previous owner of this body truly harbored such thoughts. He noticed the wound in the center of his chest and speculated that, based on the injury and the status window, it seemed more like an attempt to stab him with a knife. Then he turned to Lyra, agreeing with her, and promised not to bother her anymore. Lyra looked away, thinking that the Countess would be very pleased to hear his response. She told him she could relay those words to her right now. With a cold gaze from beneath her brows, Lyra looked at him intently and expressed her regret, noting that he still hadn't taken the medicine. The protagonist made a frightened sound, his eyes wide open as he stared at her. He mentally strained his entire body, trying to stop her, and wondered if she would leave before he took the medicine. At that moment, Lyra turned around to fetch the medicine from the table a few meters away from Calix. The protagonist, sensing that the situation was deteriorating, tried to think quickly, realizing he couldn't politely ask her to leave since she was a murderer. He cursed in Lyra's direction and began to reflect on the fact that he was a 30-year-old man trapped in the fragile body of a teenage boy with a delicate soul. Beads of sweat trickled down KX's face and body as he looked at Lyra with a tense jaw and a frightened expression. Watching her back, he started to think that maybe it would be better to just loudly make love. However, he decided against it, fearing she might cut his throat if he screamed. He realized that in that case, he would die even faster. He pursed his lips, a worried expression crossing his face, and concluded that he had no choice but to drink the poison. At that moment, Lyra approached him, holding the medicine in her hands. The main character, with a focused look ahead, halted his stream of thoughts, noticing he didn't understand one thing. He glanced at the medicine and questioned himself, why poison? Then he wondered if it wouldn't have been easier to just use his knife. As he observed how Lyra delivered the medicine to him with a smile, he realized that he now understood her intentions. She was trying to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. Calix deduced that if he was correct, this was a poison that would be hard to detect, meaning his death could easily be disguised as a suicide. He was aware of the name of this poison, it was a slow-acting one. With a slight smile, Lyra assured him that if he found it hard to swallow, she would assist him. Calix clenched his fists, recalling that he had come to this realization while playing the hero's fate. He understood that there was one undeniable truth in the game: you must always prepare for the worst-case scenario, as it could very well become a reality. If he wanted to survive, he had to be ready for anything. Lowering his head, Calix recognized that if he refused, she would likely force him to drink it. With flushed cheeks, he grinned, looking ahead and contemplating what excited him. He thought about how the hero's fate had once again cornered him. Lyra knelt before the main character, extending the medicine in his direction, then turned to him with a questioning look. Holding on to the bed, he reassured her that everything was fine before taking the medicine, which was the poison, and began to drink it. He swallowed the potion, moving his Adam's apple as he consumed the poison, while Lyra watched closely. The system window displayed a notification indicating that he had been poisoned with a slow-acting toxin. The protagonist thought this was precisely what he had anticipated. He then questioned how he could avoid death. He repeatedly instructed himself to think of Lyra. At that moment, she stood up to clear the dishes from the table, and Calix, with a pained expression, realized he needed anything that could assist him. Then, turning to himself, he expressively ordered to recall memories of Russell, who had told him that without such a valuable potion at their disposal, he might not see the dawn. Memories of Russell introducing himself with his hand pressed to his chest surfaced in his mind. The protagonist looked ahead in surprise, his eyes wide open. He then turned to Lyra and asked if she could call Russell. Lyra inquired why he needed him. The protagonist shot her an irritated look and sternly asked if he needed to report to the maid. He frowned and glared at her angrily. Lyra, confused, apologized and admitted it was foolish of her to ask such a thing. Calix began to shout that if she understood everything perfectly, she should fulfill his order as soon as possible. The protagonist realized that the high-quality potion Russell had used on him was so valuable it could be exchanged for a castle. Lyra bowed to him, holding an empty plate on a tray that had recently been poisoned, and was about to leave the room. The protagonist remained seated on the bed, contemplating that Russell seemed to be quite a kind man for fighting so hard for his life. At that moment, Lyra approached the front door to leave. Calix continued to reason that at least Russell was unlikely to pose a threat to him. Then, getting up from the bed, Calix asked if Lyra had left. He grabbed the piece of furniture with a sudden movement and began to stick his fingers deep into his throat to induce vomiting. He attempted to expel the poison he had recently ingested, trying to make it leave his body the same way it had entered, making painful sounds from his throat. Calix struggled with this but ultimately failed. He exhaled heavily from his lungs, realizing it was futile, and he urgently needed to find this thing. He understood that the hero's fate was indeed a very challenging game, but it had to be somewhere. The main character, with a clouded gaze, began to hastily search his room.